words. Okay, a journey to begin. We're starting a brand new book of Devarim, the fifth book of the Torah. We will give a brief introduction in that this book of Devarim was actually said to a totally different audience. Well, different in the sense that the first four books were told and spoken to the generation that died in the desert. Now, Moshe rabbeinu is about to leave the world, and he is handing over his last will and testament to the people that are going to enter into the promised land. And the whole book of Devarim is a speech. It's telling and speaking to the Jewish people that are going to go into the promised land and saying, these are mistakes. These are what we did that should not have happened. These are the terrible, and this is how we can go forward. So it's very different in the sense that it's a brand new book spoken to a different audience. This Shabbat is also called Shabbat Hazdan, as we will explore. Shabbat Hazdan, the word Chazon means a vision, Shabbat of Vision. So called because the reading of the Haftarah from the prophets begins with the opening verses of the book of Yeshayahu, Isaiah, who says, Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amoz. This is the vision of Yeshayahu, who has a vision and speaks to the Jewish people, reminding them of all of their unfortunate weaknesses at the time just before the destruction of the temple. He foretells the destruction of the temple. Nobody really wants to listen. So we're going to deal with that. But we're also going to speak about what the vision of this Shabbat is, not only the vision of destruction as foretold by the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah. It's in fact the Shabbat of Vision because we have an opportunity to look forward with optimism and with hope. Our vision is not only to see destruction, as important as that is, to be cognizant of loss and to mourn the loss of our temple, but at the same time, we have an incredible ability to look beyond with optimism, as is the requirement of our Jewish people. As we always do, I'm going to go through a quick summary of the whole portion of Devarim, all the things that we're going to read about this Shabbat. Starting from the top, Bnei Israel on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. You know, I always say that we have an eastern bank and a west bank. The west bank today we call the area which we know as Judea and Samaria. That was where the Jewish people lived for many, many years. The whole concept of the West Bank being taken away from those who actually indigenously belong there, and that we are the usurpers of property, is absurd, because this was where Judea and Samaria existed on the western side. But now Moses was on the eastern bank, which is present-day Jordan. He can't come into the land, he's talking to them. They're about to enter the land. Moshe rabbeinu gives his final communication before handing his soul back to Hashem. This is the last moments of his life. He delivers a veiled rebuke to the nation for the many misdeeds over the past 40 years. So very sensitively, delicately, but clearly, he speaks to the people and he says, look at the mistakes, and we're going to go through some of them. Look what we did in the past. Learn from it so we don't end up doing the same thing again and expecting a different outcome. So he begins to recount all of the events that took place over the last 40 years. Hashem multiplied you, and behold, you are today as the stars of the heavens in abundance. We weren't so abundant. Yes, we were about 3 million people, but we always speak about quantity and quality. Just like the star can look like a tiny little light, it's actually an enormous sun, major luminary. Moshe rabbeinu appoints a hierarchy of judges and instructs them about the judicial integrity, what it takes to be a judge. The Jews traveled and quickly reached Kadesh Barnea on the southern border of Israel. This is recounting events that happened 40 years ago. That's when the Jewish people said, we want to send spies. We're not sure that we want to go and take this land. We have to check it out. So you asked for spies. I allowed that to happen in the hope that they would see the truth. But they delivered a frightening report claiming that the land was unconquerable. And Israel accepted the scouts' attitude, that is the 10, rather than the other 2, which is Caleb and Joshua, who spoke positively about the promised land. But Israel listened to the 10 who spoke negatively. they decided not to enter the land. This caused Hashem to bar that entire generation. Every single man who was over the age of 20 would die over the next 40 years in the desert. So they did not enter the promised land. It was only their children to whom Moshe rabbeinu is addressing these words. Hashem instructs Bnei Israel to reverse course and head back into the desert. This is Moshe rabbeinu again, just before he hands his soul back to Hashem, talking to the next generation, recapping what has happened over the last 40 years. And then what happens is a group defiantly advanced towards Israel. They said, okay, we changed our mind. Now we do want to go to Israel. We're going. We're heading north and we're going to take the land. And they were massacred by the Amorites. Moshe rabbeinu said, don't do it. God now said 40 years in the desert, no shortcuts anymore. So that happened. Bnei Israel heeded Hashem's command and they headed back to the desert, Sinai desert. Moshe rabbeinu fast forwards 38 years. The generation which left Egypt had perished. And God instructs those entering the land not to take the land of Seir, Moab, and Ammon. Bnei Israel requested of Sichon, the Amorite king, to allow passageway through his land. He refused. Sichon waged war against Bnei Israel, the Jewish people. They were victorious and took possession of the land. Then the Bashanites, met a similar fate. The tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half the tribe of Menashe, the subject of last week's reading, were given the land of Emori and Bashan. They were given land on the eastern side of the Jordan after they had reassured Moshe rabbeinu that their request not to go into the land had nothing to do with the detractors, the spies 40 years earlier. They were in fact ready to lead the Jewish people in battle. They were brave, they were committed, they were going to lead the charge, and then only after they had settled all their brothers in the land would they go back to the lush land east of the Jordan, which was much more appropriate for their livestock. Moshe rabbeinu is recounting all of these events. Moshe delineates the borders of the land allotted to the aforementioned tribes. He reiterates that these tribes battle against the clan Canaanim before returning to their land, that they must fulfill their promise that they will first lead the Jewish people to conquer and settle the land, and only then will they return back to their families on the other side of the Jordan. Finally, Yeshua, who will lead the nation of Israel, is told not to fear. Hashem will fight for you. Do not be afraid. That's the summary of this week's reading, and it's also an introduction to continued recapping of events of the last 40 years. That's the reason that the book of Devarim, the fifth book, is actually called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah. A lot of the things that have been discussed previously are repeated. For example, next week we're going to read about the 10 Commandments, not because there was another event at Sinai, the giving of the 10 Commandments again. No, it's a retelling of the story of Sinai to the generation who are entering into the promised land. And there are many other events that are recapped and rediscussed in this book of Devarim. Let's now enter into some of its life's messages that we can take from it and apply to ourselves. First is an interesting thought from the Sfat Emet. He is a great Hasidic Rebbe, Gerer Rebbe, and he said an interesting division. We said that the 5 books of Moses are actually divided into 4 plus 1. 4 books that were related to the past or were related to the past generation. And then 1 book, which is the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, which was said to the people that we're going to go into the promised land. That's the 5 books of Moses, actually 4 plus 1. He drew an interesting parallel. For all of us who wear tefillin every single day, we wear 2 phylacteries, 2 tefillin. One of them that goes on our head, and one of them that goes on our upper arm. And there's a difference. If you take a look at those 2 boxes that we strap onto our bodies, the one that goes onto the head is actually made of 4 compartments. If you look at the tefillin, I should have brought one with me to show you, can actually see that there are 4 separate compartments. In the phylactery, the box that is placed on the upper arm, the exact same words appear as in the one that goes on the head, except in the one on the arm, it's just one box. And all the 4 passages that are found in the head tefillin are found in one box on the arm. Sfat Emes says nothing is arbitrary. Everything is part of a plan, very connected. So just as you have 4 books plus 1, you have 4 sections of the tefillin plus 1. I'm just getting feedback that the audio is not great. I'm sorry, I don't know how to improve that. I do have Wi-Fi. I'm not sure how to improve it. I hope you're able to hear me. The tefillin likewise are made up of 4 plus 1. 4 compartments on the head, 1 compartment on the hand, and the one on the hand contains everything that was in the 4 compartments that goes on the head. Which generation was compared to the head? The commentaries say that the generation that died in the desert, that experienced all the miracles of the desert, are called the Dor De'ah, the generation of knowledge. There was never a generation in the history of the Jewish people that had as much experience in witnessing God as that generation that died in the desert. They saw the splitting of the sea. They witnessed the giving of the Torah at Sinai. They saw all the miracles of the plagues in Egypt. They saw God daily feeding them manna miraculously. They saw God as no generation ever saw God. They are called the generation of the head, of the mind, because they witnessed, experienced, actually saw Hashem, as no other generation did. The new generation was the hand generation. Why hand? Because now it wasn't so much about the miracles that you experienced as much as how are you going to apply this blueprint of Torah knowledge to a physical, practical world. They were taking the world of the desert and applying it in a world of action, a world of conduct, mitzvahs being applied in the agricultural realm, in the business world, in all of the realms of a physical world. That was the new generation. That's the generation that Moses is talking to in the book of Deuteronomy, not the generation of the mind, having experienced such supernal spiritual knowledge, but to the generation that was going to be the generation of action, the mind. Mind being taken to the hand, applied, application. So the Sfas Emes says that the tefillin is likewise 4 plus 1. 4 compartments on the head. Those are representing the 4 books, the first 4 books of the Torah. And then the one that goes on the hand, which is the generation about to enter the promised land, the application of all of these lofty concepts in the way we conduct our lives. 4 plus 1. Okay, a little bit esoteric, but nevertheless from the Sfas Emes. Now, the Yalkut, which is one of the Midrashim, which tells the story behind the verses, says, who's rebuking the Jewish people here? It's not so nice to get a rebuke. They are about to go into the promised land. Moshe rabbeinu is giving the last speech, and he rebukes them. The Midrash says, let Moses, who loves them, rebuke them. As opposed to Bilam, who was the false prophet and sorcerer of Midian, who wanted to curse the Jewish people. He hated the Jewish people. He gave blessings. Well, he didn't intend the blessings. He intended to curse us, and God turned the curses into blessings. What's more valuable to us? The blessings of Bilam or the reprimand and rebuke of Moses? It's much better if you have a good friend who cares, who knows us, and tells us that we've made a mistake. As unpleasant as that experience is, it is more valuable to us in our lives than somebody who doesn't really care for us, supposedly singing our praises. We don't know what their motive is. It's not the words, it's who they're coming from. And likewise, when we rebuke children or our students at school, we need to know that if we're rebuking them as did Moshe Rabbeinu, with tremendous love, devotion, and care. That is the glue that holds together a valuable and accomplishing rebuke or reprimand, because then you know where it's coming from. They say children don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. Moshe Rabbeinu cared, he loved. And therefore, when he rebukes them, it's maybe difficult to hear the words, but certainly digesting and absorbing the words of Moshe Rabbeinu has a positive effect. And I tell a story that I've told often, the analogy that my father always used to tell about the two individuals in a home that chase or that deal with mice. The mouse that comes into the house. The cat that sees a mouse in the house is having its most exciting, exuberant day. Cats love mice in the house because they can catch them, they can play with them, they can eat them. The mouse is an absolute enjoyable moment when the mouse happens to come into the house. The housewife is obviously standing on the table with a broomstick, shrieking and screaming and calling for help. The last thing she wants is a mouse, right? Two different creatures, the wife, or sometimes the husband, where the wife resolves the problem. Depends who's in charge of getting rid of spiders and wildlife in the house. I know what it is in my house, I'm not sure in yours. But the person who really detests it is saying, go away, I don't want you, I don't want you, I don't want you. The cat is saying, I love you, come over here, I'm enjoying this. So when we rebuke and we share words in which convey to somebody that they've done something wrong, we have to ask ourselves, are we enjoying the process? Are we getting it off our own chest? Are we having our own therapy session? So we're able to get it off our chest and tell somebody off? Or are we really not wanting the problem and trying to alleviate the problem from being repeated? So motive has a huge deal in the success and the attitude that conveys the message that we're giving. I've also told the story of Reb Mendel, who was one of my teachers in yeshiva, a remarkable man, spent 13 years in the Russian Gulag for trying to teach Torah and help Jews. A remarkable, powerful human being who impacted on my life so deeply. And I once was walking into the yeshiva with him, and as we came into the yeshiva, there was one student who was screaming at another student. He obviously had done something wrong and he was getting off his chest. And when he saw my teacher, Reb Mendel, walking in, he felt a little embarrassed that he'd raised his voice. But Reb Mendel didn't let him off the hook. He said, what's the problem? Why are you getting so nervous? So he said, well, my friend did something wrong and I was trying to give him, to reprimand him and to tell him that this is not the way to behave. It's called Hacheach Tachiach Esamisecha. If you see somebody doing something wrong, you should tell them, help them resolve the problem. But Reb Mendel was a very wise man. He said, really? So the motivation was that your friend was doing something wrong and you were doing a mitzvah to help him by telling him how to behave. He says, how come I've never seen you do another mitzvah with so much emotion, devotion, involvement? I've never seen you put on tefillin and jump up and down and scream the words as you were just screaming right now. Sometimes when we get carried away with ourselves, maybe it's not the mitzvah. Maybe there's some other motive. Maybe we ourselves are happy to get it off our chest. And the poor hapless recipient is just getting us spewing out all the vile and all the anger. And that's how we have to remember when we talk to our kids, or we talk to anybody that needs to receive a message that is necessary to improve, as what was Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses was doing right now to a generation that had to understand the severity of the mistakes of the past so that they wouldn't repeat them. But it came from a Moshe Rabbeinu. He invested. He gave his life for the Jewish people. He loved them so dearly. When it came from him, it was like music. As hard as it was to hear, one knew that it was coming with love. That is how we have to ensure that if ever we say a word which we think the recipient needs to hear, make sure that it has the glue of so much love and so much devotion and so much investment in that person so that they are able to receive a word of reproach as well. Here Moses was reproaching, but who was Moses? The Moses who loved them so dearly. So, in line with that, and how to tell words of admonition, these are the words which Moses spoke to all of Israel. Says the Hasidic saying, who did Moses speak to about the negatives of the Jewish people? It was only to the people of Israel that Moses spoke of iniquities and spoke about their negatives. To God, Moses only spoke of the virtues of Israel and justified them no matter what they did. So it's what you say to whom. To the Jewish people, he was ready to share reprimand because he wanted to make sure that they would not make the same mistakes. But whenever Moses spoke to Hashem, he never said one word that could undermine and cast a disparaging image of his beloved people Israel. So if we are on the right track, saying things for the right reasons, there are a lot of tests that can ascertain whether we are doing it for the right motive. And one of them is, do we talk to somebody else about this person's weakness? Because if we do, we're completely off the track. Moses only said to the Jewish people, these are our failings. But to Hashem, to God, he only spoke of their virtues. This is a language issue, a language point, and it's taken from the Talmud, and it says, bring forth, they needed to appoint leaders, bring forth wise and understanding men, known among your tribes, and I will place them at your head. This was the distribution of authority, responsibility, delegation of responsibility, and the way that they had to choose was people who were understanding men, understood, and va'asimeim, and I will place them at your head. The word va'asimeim, and I will place them at your head, is written in the Torah lacking the letter Yud. So although we know the vowels and we read it the right way anyway, without the Yud, the same word va'asimeim can be read va'ashamam, which means guilt. So the word you'll place leaders has a connotation because of the actual spelling of the word that implies guilt. What does the Talmud say? This comes to teach us that the faults of a generation rest with its heads and leaders. If you have political leaders that are corrupt, the country is going to land up being overwhelmed by corruption. If people are not accountable at the highest level, then there is going to be absolute lawlessness in the country. And even for the rabbis, and even for anybody who is in a position of authority, know that there is a guilt element for not exercising the appropriate degree of integrity and commitment and application of leadership and authority as is required. We're going to move on. So this is called the Shabbat Hazdan, the Shabbat of Vision, as I said, because it begins the reading of the prophets, talking about the vision of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, who talks of the destruction of the temple. We're going to quote a few verses and actually go through some of his messages. So the Talmud tells us that whatever God tells us to do, he does. Obviously in a different way. The Talmud even says that we put on tefillin that say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Listen, Israel, look how great our God is. He's one. But in the tefillin, I'm saying in inverted commas, of Hashem, he also puts on tefillin. Because whatever he tells us to do, he does. What is written in God's tefillin? God doesn't have a head or an arm and straps. But what is the cognizant thought process of Hashem as our thought process is how great God is? It is the words, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goya echad ba'aretz. Look at this one nation on earth, my people Israel. I'll sing the praises of Hashem. God's thought process is sing the praise of the Jewish people. At any rate, the Talmud says when God tells us an instruction, he follows suit. He doesn't do things that he tells us not to do. If that's the case, one of the things that God told us was never destroy a shul. Correct? You're not allowed to go and destroy a place that is holy. How could God, on this Sunday, we commemorate the destruction of the temple, how could God allow the temple to be destroyed? Holiness should not be allowed to be destroyed. God tells us not to destroy places of holiness. How come God could? Interesting question. And the only time that we are allowed to destroy a shul is when we intend to build a more beautiful, bigger, and lasting shul in its place. So a shul that's standing on ground that you want to now build another shul, you have to be careful how to do this. You've got to make sure the money is there so you don't land up with a destruction without the building. But it's almost like a set of Lego where you have your children build this beautiful house and then a bit of it gets bashed in. So then the child takes apart all the Legos, but when they're doing that, they're only taking it down in order to rebuild. That's the only time we are allowed to destroy it. And Hashem destroyed a temple, as we'll soon discuss, that had already been so detrimental and so negative that not lived up to its purpose. He destroyed it only because the third temple, the one that's yet to be built, will be built on that hallowed soil. The destruction then is only a first stage to greater building. Like you see in a construction site next door Belfort Park for the last months, they've been taking down numerous buildings for months, these huge trucks and tractors, and they're bashing. But all of us knew the sign said it all, that in this space we're going to build a new building. If that's the case, then the destructive elements of bringing down the building is a first stage of building something better. Only because Hashem intends to build a temple in the future did he take down a temple that had unfortunately become a place filled with negativity, as we'll soon see. Now, one of the interesting things about this Shabbat, Chazon, is that it is always the Shabbos that precedes the date of Tisha B'Av. This year, Tisha B'Av begins on Saturday night. In fact, begins before Shabbat even ends. We stop eating. And then it goes all the way from about 5:40, I don't remember the exact times, to about 5:50 to 6:40, something like that. Look at my communications so you get the times right. So the Shabbat that precedes Tisha B'Av, in fact, this year, Tisha B'Av should have been on Shabbos itself. But because we don't fast on Shabbos, other than when Yom Kippur falls on Shabbos, but any of the fast days that commemorate sad events are postponed. So Tisha B'Av is moved from the 9th of Av to the 10th of Av on Sunday, and that's when we fast. The Shabbos that precedes the fast of Tisha B'Av is called Shabbat Chazon. Now, what's interesting about Tisha B'Av, there are certain prayers in the service which we omit whenever it is called a Yontif. So there's a prayer called the Tachanun, which we do not say on Shabbos, we do not say on Pesach, we do not say on Sukkot, never on a Yontif. And we also don't say it on Tisha B'Av. And one of the commentaries explains why not. Because there's one reference, and we read it in the book of Eicha, Jeremiah, that calls the day a Mo'ed. Mo'ed normally means a Yontif. So now we have this incongruous, impossible to understand thought that Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the year in which we fast for the loss of the temple, is somehow associated with a Yontif, with a happy day. And one of the commentaries explains because ultimately Tisha B'Av, which is the saddest day of the year, will be transformed into a happy day when the temple is rebuilt. But that's not now. That's after time. When Mashiach comes, the saddest day will become a happy day. How can we call the unhappy day of Tisha B'Av a day that seems to be Moed? Moed is the word used for Yontif. Tisha B'Av is not a Yontif. But the actual word Moed means a meeting point. The Ohel Moed was the tent of meeting. Moed means a meeting in time. And the various festivals are called Moed because that's a greater meeting with Hashem. We sense Hashem's presence more. And this is the irony. In our saddest day, we don't sense abandonment by Hashem. We sense Hashem's presence even more. How so? Because this day of Tisha B'Av is so associated with events that were negative for the Jewish people, because again and again throughout history, it was the date that difficult issues and events befell the Jewish people. It cannot be by chance that the first temple and the second temple and the expulsion from Spain in 1492 all happened on Tisha B'Av. That the First World War, which was the precursor to the Second World War and the Holocaust, started on Tisha B'Av. Again and again through history, we have seen events happening on this self-same day. What that tells us then is that when there are troubles befalling the Jewish people, it's not because God discarded us, abandoned us, that we are now just like a leaf in the wind where nothing is by design. The incredible design that God visited troubles on us through history on this particular date means that there is a master of this world. There is a meeting point with God in the saddest, most tragic, most difficult moments, which we don't understand, we cannot comprehend, which we're struggling to give meaning for. One thing we do know came from Hashem. Look at the design. Look at how it's always been on this date. And therefore, God, I know you there. I don't understand you always. I struggle to understand why you do the things you do, because they hurt. Sometimes they're very painful. But one thing I'm reassured, this is not a world of chance. This is a world of design. And you're there, my Father. You have only my long-term interests at heart. I don't understand you always, but I know you care for me. That is why Tisha B'Av is called Moed, a meeting point with God, even in our tragedy. I want to take 4 verses from the Haftarah and try and go a little bit into the depth of the verses themselves and see that there is a common theme that develops in Isaiah's words to the Jewish people. He begins by saying, Yada shor konehu, v'chamor evus ba'alav. Yisrael lo yada, ami lo ehid banan. An ox knows his owner. A donkey knows where his master's crib is to go there to drink, to eat from his trough. Even an animal knows. But Yisrael lo yada. My people Israel does not know where home is. They don't know where their owner, their master, their father is. My people does not consider. So Isaiah is chastising the Jewish people and he's saying, Jewish people, even a donkey knows where to go home at night. He goes out in the field, he pastures, the ox is grazing in the field the whole day, but when it comes the moment that he is cold and needs to rest, he knows where to go home. And our Jewish people, we're searching everywhere else. We have young people looking for God on the mountains of Himalaya. We have people looking for spirituality in every forsaken area of the world, and we forgot where home is. We think we have our reassurance with our banking and our industry and our tremendously smart acumen that we've achieved in our workplace. We are the masters of our destiny. We feel so. How come a donkey knows where to come home? Says Isaiah. And my people Israel have forgotten where home is. So what we're going to see is there's a bit of a theme developing, and that is that there is a common theme that we're going to draw through all of these different verses that we're quoting, and that is that we have to deal not with the symptoms, but we have to deal with the issue itself. That is how we can find a solution to our problems. We need to recognize not just how things appear. We cannot address the wound. We have to address what's causing it. So here, Isaiah is beginning first line. I'm doing this, I'm numbering the different themes that come out of these verses. We lost the loss of a place on high, which is the high temple, the holy temple. We can bemoan the fact that God allowed the temple to be destroyed, the home of the Jewish people and God to be destroyed. But the problem was much deeper than that. The problem wasn't that a physical house was taken from us. The problem was that we forgot where to come home, even when the temple was standing. So let's not only address the loss of the physical structure of the temple. Let's address the fact that we ourselves had lost our ability, the ability that even a donkey has to come home. We had turned our back on the temple, even when it was standing. So the loss was not only the physical walls, but the much deeper cause of those symptoms, the disease itself. And let's follow that theme through the second verse that I'm quoting, a little bit further on. It says, he says, from the sole of the foot until the head. This is his metaphor, very poetic metaphor of the Jewish people. There is no soundness, wounds and confusion and lacerated sores. He says the body is covered in sores from the foot to the head. Imagine the entire body covered in festering wounds. But that's not the extent of the problem. They have not sprinkled, neither have they been bandaged, nor was it softened with oil. What's he saying in the metaphor? Far deeper than the problem of having a wound was that the body was not dealing with it. What do you do when you have a wound? You dress the wound. You put on the oil that is required. You put on the ointment and the disinfectant. You put on the bandages that can bring healing. One of the greatest diseases today is an immune deficiency, where the body is no longer fighting the disease, the dreaded disease that is attacking the body. That's much worse. To have a wound is a problem. To have a wound and not to address it, then your problem is not just the presenting wound. The problem is a much deeper problem. It's a problem of not even caring to address and to fight the ill health. The body is shut down. Your problem is not just the wound. The problem is that your body is no longer fighting to survive. All of that's a metaphor. The Jewish people are filled with all of this disease, the problems. Look at the problems surrounding us. It says Isaiah, the problems are much deeper. That's how they present themselves. There's a wound. But the problem is much deeper. There's unfortunately a Jewish people that is not addressing its own weaknesses and problems. We're covering them over. We're pretending. We're using all the creams that hide the wound and not addressing them. The third verse that I'm quoting from these words of Isaiah, he says, had the Lord of hosts left us as a remnant, we would soon be like Sodom. We would resemble Gomorrah. Who remembers what the city of Sodom was? Remember the story, the nephew of Abraham. Lot went to live in the city of Sodom. And the bylaws of the city of Sodom was that you're not allowed to have visitors, you're not allowed to have guests, no chesed, It was illegal to do an act of kindness. Sodom was so evil and so bad that eventually God turned it over with sulfur and salt, and the entire region was turned into a death valley. The most lush area was turned into the salt pans of the Dead Sea. So what does Isaiah say? He said, if God had left you for a minute longer in our ways, it would be like Sodom. What does he mean it would resemble Sodom? We could resemble Sodom in the way it presents itself. Sodom was destroyed. God turned it over. There was this mass destruction and everyone in the city died. We might think that's the metaphor. We like Sodom because we shared their fate. Just like they were destroyed, our temple was destroyed. No, says Isaiah, much deeper. Why are we like Sodom? Not only because we shared their fate. We shared their evil. We behaved like the people of Sodom. We didn't care for the orphan, and we didn't look after the ill and the infirmed and the elderly. We looked the other way when people needed help, like the city of Sodom. We weren't just like Sodom because we shared the same symptoms of destruction. We were like Sodom because our behavior patterns resembled the evil of the city of Sodom. The common theme is that Isaiah is saying we can bemoan the loss of the temple, or we can look deeper and understand the root causes and the reason why we suffered. And I'm giving one more example. He says, your new moons, your Rosh Chodesh, your happy moments of the new moon, appointed season, Yontif, says God, referring to God, my soul hates, says Isaiah. Why? They are a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. And he continues to say that we had sacrifices brought that were stolen. We used supposedly holy activity that was born out of illegitimate, inappropriate behavior. There was no integrity. There was no honesty. God saw the sacrifices and he hated them. So let's not just bemoan the fact that we lost the opportunity to sacrifice. We actually lost our sacrifices long before the Romans took it away. We had destroyed from the inside the integrity and the holiness of our holy temple. So Isaiah, there are other chapters in which he builds the Jewish people and he says, God's never forsaken you and he'll never give up on you and he loves you and you are the apple of his eye. He reminds the Jewish people of their potential. But in this passage, he's calling it like it is. And he's saying, don't only look at the symptom. Don't only look at the destruction of the bricks and the mortar of the temple. Look at the destruction of the integrity, honesty, religious, appropriate behavior that took place within, because we had lost the plot even before the Romans arrived. They came and destroyed a structure that had already been gutted from within. Our conduct at the time that was inappropriate. We hated one another. We didn't build one another. We had no Avos Yisrael. We didn't care for one another. All the things that happened in the temple. The hour is 8 o'clock. Time goes by very quickly. The ultimate last point that I want to speak about is that the vision of this Shabbos is not only the vision of destruction. The Lady Yitzchak Abaditchev says it's on this Shabbat, more than on any other Shabbat, particularly this year, where Shabbat supplants the fasting, pushes it away. We see the ray of the joy and the beauty of the Shabbos transcending the day that would have been a day of fasting. It's on this Shabbos, amidst all of the tragedy and difficulties that we're thinking about, Shabbos reminds us that there's hope, that there is a day that is associated with godliness and spirituality. It's on this Shabbat that we see a glimmer of the rebuilding of the final temple more than on any other Shabbat. This Shabbat should not only be associated with a vision of being able to see the pain and the suffering and the loss, but more importantly, it should be a Shabbat of vision where we lift our eyes and we lift our hearts and we lift our hopes and we commit ourselves to building and to growing and to developing and seeing the future of our people with hope, the vision of hope. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Stop sharing. able to say goodbye to anybody. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you so
Chava,
much,
Aline.
Rabbi. Fantastic.
Thank you, Rabbi.
For joining.
Thank
Selden,
you.
thanks for
Thank
coming.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank
Evie,
you.
nice to see you. Eleanor, thank you. Joy,
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Very
Thank you.
Barry, have a beautiful, beautiful week and a good Shabbos. See you soon.
Thanks, Rabbi.
God bless.